share, subscribe.
You know, there's something about lighthouses that we've all gotten wrong. We see them in paintings, on postcards, standing tall against crashing waves. These romantic beacons of hope, guiding lost souls home. But I'm here to tell you something that will change how you see them forever. Lighthouses aren't symbols of salvation. They're warnings. They're monuments to the things we should never approach, never touch, never bring into our ordinary lives. I've spent months researching, collecting stories from people who've lived through experiences that defy explanation. What I've discovered is that some objects, particularly those connected to these ancient towers, carry more than just history. They carry something alive, something hungry, something that waits for the right person to stumble upon it. Tonight, I'm going to share 5 stories with you. 5 accounts from men who thought they understood the world, who lived comfortable, predictable lives until they encountered something that shattered everything they believed. These aren't just ghost stories or urban legends. These are confessions, shared in whispered voices by people who can never quite sleep peacefully again. Before we begin this journey together, I need to ask you something. What would you do if you discovered that an ordinary object in your home wasn't ordinary at all? What if it was watching you, learning from you, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its true nature? Hold on to that thought, because after tonight, you might find yourself looking at your own possessions very differently now. Before we dive into these chilling tales, I want you to do something for me and for yourself. Hit that like button if you're ready to question everything you think you know about the objects around you. Subscribe to Whisper and Wonders to help us reach 10,000 subscribers, because we're building a community of people who aren't afraid to look into the darkness and acknowledge what's looking back. And please, comment below with your thoughts or any experiences you might have had with objects that seemed ... different. Your stories matter, and they help others realize they're not alone in what they've witnessed. Here's something that might surprise you. 98% of you listening right now haven't subscribed yet. I understand sometimes we're hesitant to commit to something that challenges our comfortable worldview. But I promise you this, if you subscribe, you'll be among the first to hear the stories that others are too afraid to tell. Stories that will thrill you, terrify you, and make you question the very nature of reality itself. So take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for the first tale. Because once you hear it, there's no going back to seeing the world the same way again. My name is David, and I need to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made. It started 3 months ago when my wife Sarah and I moved into what we thought was our dream home, a 2-story colonial in Millbrook Heights, one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone, where kids still ride bikes until dark, and where the biggest worry is whether the homeowners association will approve your new mailbox. The house came with a finished basement that the previous owner had used as a study. Dark wood paneling, built-in bookshelves, the kind of masculine retreat that made me feel like I was finally becoming the man I'd always imagined I'd be at 35. But it was what I found behind those bookshelves that changed everything. I was installing new Ethernet cables when I noticed a gap behind the center shelf unit. Not a gap, a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that felt ancient beneath my fingers, was a brass telescope. Not just any telescope, but something that looked like it belonged on the deck of a 19th century ship. Etched into the brass was a single word: beacon. The thing was beautiful in that heavy, substantial way that modern electronics never are. When I extended it to its full length, the brass caught the basement's fluorescent light and seemed to glow with its own inner warmth. I called Sarah down to see it, and she smiled that indulgent smile wives give their husbands when they find a new toy. Probably worth something, she said, running her finger along the intricate engravings. Maybe it's from the lighthouse. She was referring to Millbrook Lighthouse, about 2 miles from our house. The thing had been decommissioned decades ago, but it still stood out there on the point, a local landmark that drew tourists and photographers. I'd never paid it much attention, but holding this telescope, I felt a strange pull toward it. That first night, I took the telescope up to our bedroom window, which faced east toward the water. Through the lens, the lighthouse appeared impossibly clear, as if I were standing right at its base instead of 2 miles away. I could see every detail of the weathered stone, every crack in the mortar, even what looked like scratches in the metal door at its base. But there was something else, something that made my hands tremble as I held the eyepiece to my face. There were lights moving inside the lighthouse. Not electric lights, something softer, more organic, like fireflies dancing behind the windows. I tried to tell myself it was just reflections, maybe security lights or maintenance workers. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The lighthouse had been abandoned for 30 years. There was no electricity running to it, no reason for anyone to be inside. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to that telescope every evening. Sarah would be downstairs watching TV or reading, and I'd slip upstairs with the excuse of checking emails or reading. But really, I was watching the lighthouse. And the more I watched, the more I saw. The lights weren't random. They moved in. Patterns like someone or something was walking through the rooms, carrying a lamp from window to window. Sometimes the light would pause at one window for what felt like hours, and I'd get the strangest sensation that whatever was holding that light was looking back at me. It was Tuesday of the second week when I saw him for the first time. I was adjusting the focus, trying to get an even clearer view of the lighthouse's upper windows, when a figure stepped into the lamp room at the very top. Even from 2 miles away, even through a telescope that should have made details impossible to distinguish, I could see him perfectly. He was tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like an old maritime uniform, brass buttons, high collar, a peaked cap that cast shadows over his face. But it wasn't his appearance that made my blood run cold. It was the way he moved, deliberately, purposefully, like he was performing some kind of ritual. He raised something to his face, another telescope. I realized with a jolt of recognition it felt like ice water in my veins. He was looking back at me, for what felt like an eternity. We stared at each other across those 2 miles of darkness. I couldn't see his face, couldn't make out his features, but I felt his attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his telescope and raised one hand in what could have been a greeting or a warning. I yanked my eye away from the telescope so fast I nearly dropped it. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to set the instrument down on the windowsill. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, the lighthouse was dark. That night, I dreamed about the figure in the lighthouse. In my dream, I was walking up an endless spiral staircase, the walls lined with brass instruments, compasses, sextants, chronometers, and dozens of telescopes just like mine. At the top of the stairs, the figure was waiting for me, and when he turned around, his face was my own face, but older, hollowed out by years of watching and waiting. I woke up gasping, Sarah shaking my shoulder and asking if I was okay. I told her it was just work stress, but I couldn't shake the image of that other version of myself, standing in the lighthouse with that terrible, patient expression. The next evening, I tried to resist the pull of the telescope. I made dinner. With Sarah, we watched a movie. I even suggested we go to bed early. But around 11 o'clock, when she was asleep beside me, I found myself at the window again. The lighthouse was lit up like a Christmas tree. Every window glowed with that soft, dancing light, and I could see figures moving through every level. Not just one figure, dozens of them, all wearing the same maritime uniform, all carrying their own telescopes, and they were all looking in my direction. I should have stopped then. I should have wrapped that telescope back in its leather covering and hidden it away, maybe even thrown it out, but I couldn't. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to put it down, but my hands wouldn't obey. Instead, I found myself adjusting the focus, trying to see the figures more clearly. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The figures weren't just looking toward my house. They were looking at specific windows. The kitchen window where Sarah made coffee every morning. The living room window where we watched TV in the evenings. The bedroom window where I stood every night with the telescope dot. They were watching us, learning our routines, studying us, but the worst part was yet to come. As I watched, frozen with a terror I couldn't name, one of the figures in the lamp room, the same tall figure I'd seen before, raised a massive telescope to his eye. This one was different from the others, bigger, older, with brass fittings that seemed to pulse with their own light. Through my telescope, I watched him watch me. And in that moment, I understood with crystal clarity that he could see me just as clearly as I could see him. Every detail of my face, every expression of growing horror, every bead of sweat forming on my forehead. He lowered his telescope and held up a piece of paper to the window. Even from 2 miles away, I could read what was written on it in large. Careful letters. Tomorrow night, midnight, come to the lighthouse. I stumbled backward from the window, the telescope clattering to the floor. Sarah stirred, but didn't wake. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the bedroom, staring at the telescope where it lay on the carpet, too afraid to pick it up and too afraid to leave it alone. The next day passed in a haze of anxiety and dread. I called in sick to work, claiming food poisoning, and spent the morning researching the lighthouse online. What I found didn't help my state of mind. The Millbrook Lighthouse had been built in 1847 and had operated continuously until 1962, when it was decommissioned due to advances in maritime navigation technology. During its 115 years of operation, it had seen more than its share of tragedy. 7 lighthouse keepers had died while stationed there, most under mysterious circumstances. The last keeper, a man named Edmund Harrow, had been found dead in the lamp room in 1962, apparently from a heart attack, though the coroner noted unusual circumstances that were never fully explained. But it was the final paragraph of one article that made my hands shake as I read it. Local maritime records indicate that Edmund Harrow had been collecting nautical instruments for years, including a rare brass telescope manufactured specifically for lighthouse operations. This telescope, along with the rest of Harrow's personal effects, disappeared from the lighthouse after his death and was never recovered. I looked up from my laptop screen at the telescope sitting on the kitchen table, where I'd placed it that morning in an attempt to keep it away from the bedroom window. The brass seemed duller in the daylight, but I could still make out the word beacon etched into its surface. Edmund Harrow's telescope. It had to be dot as evening approached. My dread deepened into something approaching panic. Sarah noticed my distress over dinner, commenting that I looked pale and asking repeatedly if I was feeling all right. I made excuses about work stress and the adjustment to the new house, but I could see the worry in her eyes. At 11:30 p.m., I made a decision that I still regret. Instead of ignoring the summons, instead of breaking the telescope, or throwing it away, or doing any of the sensible things a rational person might do, I kissed Sarah goodbye as she slept and walked out into the night. The walk to the lighthouse took me along deserted suburban streets and then down a winding coastal path that I'd never explored before. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light that should have been beautiful, but instead felt ominous and threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound of wind through the grass sounded like whispered warnings. Lighthouse loomed before me, bigger than it had appeared through the telescope, more imposing and somehow more alive. The metal door at its base stood open, though I was certain it had been sealed for decades. Warm light spilled out from the opening, carrying with it the smell of burning whale oil and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I didn't want to identify. I should have turned around. I should have run back to my safe suburban home and my sleeping wife and my normal, predictable life. Instead, I stepped through that doorway and began climbing the spiral staircase that led to the lamp room. The stairs were exactly as they had been in my dream, lined with nautical instruments that gleamed in the lamplight. But these weren't museum pieces or decorative antiques. These were tools that had been used, worn smooth by countless hands, stained with salt and time, and something darker dot with each step upward. I could hear voices, not speaking, but humming a low, rhythmic sound like a ship's engine or the drone of distant foghorns. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the lighthouse were alive and breathing around me. At the top of the stairs, the lamp room opened before me, like the inside of a vast eye. The original lighthouse lens had been replaced by something. I couldn't immediately comprehend a collection of mirrors and prisms and curved glass that seemed to bend light in impossible ways. And standing at the center of it all was Edmund. Harrow. He looked exactly as he had through the telescope, but seeing him up close revealed details that made my skin crawl. His uniform was pristine, as if it had just been pressed, but his face was the face of a man who had been dead for 60 years. Gray skin stretched tight over prominent bones, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "David," he said, and his voice sounded like wind through broken glass. "I've been waiting for you." He gestured to the collection of telescopes arranged around the lamp room, dozens of them, all pointed in different directions, all focused on different houses and different neighborhoods. Through each eyepiece, I could see into someone's private life. A woman reading in bed, a man working late at his computer, a family watching television, unaware that they were being observed. "Every lighthouse keeper needs his instruments," Harrow explained, running his fingers along the brass fittings of the nearest telescope. "How else can we watch over our charges? How else can we guide them home?" "I don't understand," I managed to whisper, though part of me was beginning to understand all too well. "You found my telescope," he said, moving closer. "You used it. You saw what it could show you. And now you understand what it means to be a keeper." He held out his hand, and I saw that his fingers were stained with something dark and oily. "Welcome to your new position, David. The lighthouse needs a living keeper, someone to tend the light and watch over the neighborhood, someone to use the instruments and gather the information we need." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to run. But as I stood there in that impossible room, surrounded by those watching telescopes, I felt the weight of Edmund Harrow's attention and the attention of all the other figures I'd seen in the lighthouse. They were all former keepers, I realized. All men who had found telescopes, who had been drawn to the lighthouse, who had been given the same choice I was being given now. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. Harrow's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "Then you go home to your wife. You go back to your normal life. But the telescope stays with you, and you'll find that you can't stop using it. You'll watch and watch until the watching becomes all you can do, until you forget to eat, forget to sleep, forget everything except the need to see more, to know more, to understand what's happening in all those other houses, all those other lives." He gestured to one of the telescopes, and through its eyepiece, I could see my own house, my own bedroom window where I'd stood night after night. "Eventually, you'll waste away at that window, and your wife will find your body. And then the telescope will find its way to someone else, and the cycle will begin again. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Accepted the position that night. Harrow explained my duties: tend the light, maintain the instruments, watch over the neighborhood, and report any unusual activities. He didn't explain what unusual activities meant, and I was afraid to ask. I've been the keeper of Millbrook Lighthouse for 3 months now. During the day, I maintain the pretense of my normal life. I go to work. I have dinner with Sarah. I pretend that everything is fine. But every night, I return to the lighthouse and take my position among the telescopes. The worst part isn't the isolation or the fear, or even the growing suspicion that I'm watching and reporting on people for purposes I don't understand. The worst part is that I'm starting to enjoy it. There's a power in seeing into people's private lives, in knowing their secrets, their fears, their most intimate moments. There's a satisfaction in the watching that I can't deny. Last week, Sarah mentioned that she was thinking about getting a telescope for stargazing. She'd seen one in an antique shop downtown, she said. Brass, with beautiful engravings. Very reasonably priced. I told her it sounded lovely, and I meant it. After all, every keeper needs an apprentice eventually. And I'm starting to understand that watching alone isn't nearly as satisfying as watching together. If you live in a house with windows, if you've ever felt like someone was watching you from the darkness outside, if you've ever found an old telescope, or bought one from an antique shop, or inherited one from a relative you barely knew, I want you to remember this story. I want you to think very carefully about what you might be inviting into your life, because somewhere out there, in lighthouses that should be abandoned, in rooms that should be empty, there are people like me. People who were given a choice that wasn't really a choice. People who now spend their nights watching, learning, and waiting for the next curious soul to pick up the wrong instrument and look in the wrong direction. The light in the lighthouse never really goes out. It just changes hands. And if you ever see a figure standing at your window with a telescope pointed toward a lighthouse in the distance, don't assume it's just a neighbor with a harmless hobby. Look closer. Look at how still they stand, how long. They watch, how their attention never wavers, because that might be the last normal thing you ever see. My name is Marcus, and I used to believe that moving to the suburbs would solve all my problems. After 15 years of cramped apartments and city noise, the idea of a quiet neighborhood seemed like paradise. That was before I found the bell. Ridgemont Gardens is the kind of place where people move to escape tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, the gentle hum of central air conditioning on summer evenings. My wife Jennifer and I bought a modest ranch house on Elm Street. Nothing fancy, but it had something I dreamed of for years. A workshop in the garage where I could finally pursue my hobby of restoring antique items. The previous owner, an elderly man named Arthur Pemberton, had passed away 3 months before we moved in. His children lived out of state and had cleared out most of his belongings, but they'd left behind some items in the garage workshop old. Tools, half-finished projects, things they thought might be useful to whoever bought the house. That's where I found it. Tucked away on a dusty shelf behind paint cans and rusty screws was a brass ship's bell, about the size of a dinner plate. It was tarnished black with age, but I could make out an inscription around its rim. Millbrook Light Station minus 1847. The same lighthouse I could see in the distance from our backyard, standing silent on the rocky point about 3 miles away. The bell was beautiful, even under all that tarnish. Heavy, substantial, with a rich tone when I tapped it gently with my knuckle. I could imagine it hanging on the deck of some 19th century vessel, calling sailors to meals or marking the changing of the watch. It would make a perfect restoration project, something to occupy my evenings while Jennifer graded papers at the kitchen table. I spent weeks researching the proper way to clean antique brass. ordering special compounds and soft brushes, working on the bell for an hour or two each night after dinner. Jennifer would bring me coffee and admire my progress, running her fingers over the increasingly bright metal as the original golden color began to emerge. "It's going to look beautiful when you're finished," she said one evening, watching me work on the intricate rope pattern that decorated the bell's crown. "Maybe we can hang it on the back porch." The idea appealed to me. I imagined sitting on our deck on quiet summer evenings, occasionally ringing the bell just to hear its clear, musical tone carry across the neighborhood. There was something deeply satisfying about the thought of giving this old maritime artifact a new purpose, a new home. Took me almost a month to fully restore the bell. When I finally finished, it gleamed like burnished gold in the workshop's fluorescent light. The inscription was now clearly visible: Millbrook Light Station, 1847, in memory of the lost. I hadn't noticed that last part before. It had been too obscured by tarnish, but it added a poignant touch to the piece. I hung the bell from a bracket I'd installed on our back deck that Saturday morning. Jennifer made iced tea, and we spent the afternoon sitting outside, admiring how the bell caught the sunlight. Around 4 o'clock, I couldn't resist giving it a gentle ring. The sound was perfect clear, resonant, carrying across the quiet neighborhood like a voice from another time. We heard it echo off the houses around us, watched a few neighbors step onto their porches to see where the sound had come from. Mrs. Patterson from next door waved and called out that it sounded lovely. That first ring should have been the last. The trouble started 3 days later. I was working late in my home office when I heard a single clear chime from the back deck. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. There was no wind that night, no reason for the bell to ring on its own. I went to the back door and peered out through the glass. The deck was empty, the bell hanging motionless in the still air. I told myself it must have been something else, maybe a neighbor's wind chimes or the sound of someone closing a car door. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. The next night, it happened again. Same time, 11:47 p.m., one clear, deliberate chime. This time I was ready. I slipped out onto the deck and examined the bell carefully. No sign of what might have caused it to ring. No wind, no vibration. Nothing. Jennifer hadn't heard it either night, which I found strange. The bell was loud enough to wake the dead, but when I mentioned it to her, she just gave me that look wives give their husbands when they think they're being silly. "Maybe it's settling," she suggested. "You know, adjusting to the temperature changes at night." I wanted to believe her, but brass doesn't ring itself. Bells need force to make sound, a clapper striking the sides, wind catching the metal, something physical and explainable. What I was hearing defied explanation. By the end of the first week, the bell was ringing every night at exactly 11:47 p.m. Always one chime, always clear and deliberate. I started staying up to listen for it, positioning myself at the back door with a clear view of the deck. But no matter how carefully I watched, I never saw the bell move. It would simply produce that single haunting note, then fall silent. I began researching the bell's history, diving into local maritime records and lighthouse archives. What I found made my late-night vigils even more unsettling. The Millbrook Light Station had indeed operated from 1847 to 1962, and during those 115 years, it had used a warning bell system to alert ships during heavy fog. The Bell My Bell had been part of that system. But according to the records, it had been removed from service in 1923 after what the reports described as irregularities in its operation. The irregularities were never clearly explained, but I found references in old Coast Guard reports to complaints from local residents about a bell that would ring at all hours of the night, disturbing the peace and causing anxiety among the townspeople. The lighthouse keepers claimed the bell was operating normally, ringing only when activated by the fog signal apparatus. But the complaints persisted until the bell was finally removed and replaced with a modern electric horn. More disturbing were the casualty reports I found. Between 1847 and 1923, 17 ships had been wrecked on the rocks near Millbrook Lighthouse, despite the warning systems. Most of these wrecks had occurred during clear weather, when the fog signals shouldn't have been operating at all. The reports noted that survivors consistently claimed they had heard a bell calling them toward the rocks, guiding them away from safe passage. After the bell was removed in 1923, the shipwrecks stopped. I printed out these reports and read them, over and over, trying to reconcile what I was learning with the beautiful, innocent-looking bell hanging on my deck. It seemed impossible that this restored antique could be connected to maritime disasters from a century ago. But every night at 11:47 p.m., it continued to ring its single, inexplicable chime. The second week brought a new development. Jennifer started having nightmares. She would wake up gasping, clutching at the sheets, describing dreams where she was walking through thick fog toward a sound that called to her. In the dreams, she said, the sound was comforting, familiar, like someone calling her home. But when she tried to follow it, she would find herself standing at the edge of a cliff with black water crashing against the rocks below. "It's just stress," she insisted, when I suggested she might be hearing the bell in her sleep. End of the school year, all the grading, the adjustment to the new house. I'll be fine once summer vacation starts. But I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she started avoiding the back deck where the bell hung. She began going to bed earlier, claiming she was tired, but I could hear her tossing and turning through the bedroom wall. Meanwhile, I found myself drawn to the bell in ways I couldn't explain. During the day, I would find excuses to go outside and look at it, admiring how the afternoon sun made the brass glow like captured fire. I started polishing it regularly, keeping it spotless and bright, though I couldn't say why this felt so important. It was during one of these polishing sessions that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The inscription around the bell's rim, the one that read, "In memory of the lost," wasn't original. The brass had been re-engraved, probably decades after the bell's manufacture. Someone had added those words later, though why, I couldn't imagine. That night, I positioned myself on the deck at 11:45 p.m., determined to see exactly what happened when the bell rang. I sat in our patio chair with a clear view of the bell, watching its brass surface reflect the moonlight dot at exactly 11:47 p.m. The bell began to glow, not with reflected light, but with its own internal illumination, as if someone had lit a candle inside the metal itself. The glow pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and with each pulse came that clear, resonant chime. But this time, I could see what was causing the sound. The bell wasn't ringing in the traditional sense. Instead, the metal itself was vibrating, producing the chime through some internal resonance that defied physics. And as it glowed and rang, I could swear I saw faces in the brass, dozens of them, pressed against the inside surface like people trapped underwater, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled backward off the deck, nearly falling down the steps to the lawn. When I looked back, the bell was dark and silent, hanging innocently from its bracket as if nothing had happened. But I had seen those faces. I knew with absolute certainty that they were the faces of the lost, the sailors who had followed the bell's call toward the rocks, the people who had died because they trusted a sound that led them astray. The next morning, I told Jennifer everything. About the research, about the shipwrecks, about what I'd seen the night before. I expected her to think I was losing my mind, but instead, she just nodded with the weary acceptance of someone who had been fighting her own supernatural battle. "I've been hearing it in my dreams," she admitted. "Not just the ringing, but voices. People calling for help. begging someone to stop ringing the bell. I thought I was going crazy. We decided to get rid of the bell that very day. I climbed onto the deck and reached for the bracket, ready to take it down and drive it to the nearest antique shop or museum or anywhere that wasn't our home. But I couldn't do it. My hands wouldn't obey me. Every time I reached for the bell, my fingers would stop just short of touching the brass, as if there were an invisible barrier protecting it. I tried using tools, tried wrapping my hands in towels, tried everything I could think of, but nothing worked. The bell remained beyond my reach, hanging there like it belonged, like it had always been part of our home. Maybe we need to call someone, Jennifer suggested, a priest or someone who deals with this kind of thing. But before we could make any calls, the bell's behavior changed again. That night, instead of one chime at 11:47 p.m., it rang continuously for exactly 60 seconds. The sound was deafening, echoing through the neighborhood like an air raid siren. Lights came on in houses all around us, and I could see neighbors stepping onto their porches, looking confused and alarmed. But when I called Mrs. Patterson the next morning to apologize for the disturbance, she had no idea what I was talking about. "A bell?" she said, sounding genuinely puzzled. "I didn't hear any bell, Marcus. Are you feeling all right?" I called 3 other neighbors with the same result. None of them had heard anything unusual the night before. According to them, it had been perfectly quiet. That's when I understood the truth. The bell wasn't ringing for the neighborhood. It was ringing for us. Jennifer and I were the only ones who could hear it, the only ones who mattered to whatever force was operating through. That restored brass artifact Dot, we were being called. Over the next week, the ringing became more frequent and more complex. Instead of simple chimes, the bell began producing elaborate sequences of sound-long rings, short rings, patterns that reminded me of Morse code or ship signals. Jennifer started walking in her sleep, and twice I found her standing on the back deck in her nightgown, staring at the bell with an expression of terrible longing. "It wants us to follow it," she said one morning over coffee, her voice flat and exhausted. "In my dreams, I can see where it wants us to go. Down to the water, out to the lighthouse. There are people there, Marcus. People who've been waiting for so long." I knew she was right. I could feel the pull myself now, a constant tugging sensation that grew stronger every time I looked at the bell. During the day, I found myself staring out the back window, watching the way the light played across the brass surface. At night, I would lie awake listening for the ringing, anticipating it, almost looking forward to it. We were being prepared for something, trained like laboratory animals to respond to the bells. Call. And despite my terror, despite my desperate desire to resist, I could feel my will eroding with each passing day. The end came on a Tuesday night in late June. The bell began ringing at sunset and didn't stop. Not the usual patterns or sequences, but a continuous, urgent tolling that seemed to say, "Now, come now, it's time." Jennifer got out of bed without a word and walked toward the back door. I followed her, unable to resist the pull any longer. We stepped onto the deck, and the bell's glow was brighter than I'd ever seen it, casting everything in golden light that made the night look like day. Dot in that light, I could see them clearly. Faces in the brass, the people who had answered the bell's call over the decades. They were smiling now, welcoming, their hands pressed against the inside of the bell, as if they were trying to reach through to embrace us. Jennifer stepped off the deck and began walking across the lawn toward the path that led down to the water. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like someone in a trance, but her face was peaceful, almost happy. I followed her, my feet moving without conscious direction, drawn by the bell's relentless call. We walked through the quiet streets of Ridgemont Gardens, past the houses where our neighbors slept peacefully, unaware that 2 of their community or being led away into the night. The bells ringing followed us, growing louder with each step until it seemed to fill the entire world with its golden sound dot at the shoreline. We could see the lighthouse in the distance, its windows glowing with the same warm light that emanated from the bell. There were figures moving in those windows, the same welcoming faces we'd seen in the brass. People who had found their way home after years of wandering. Jennifer waded into the water without hesitation, the bell's call pulling her deeper with each step. I followed, feeling the cold waves rise around my ankles, my knees, my waist. The lighthouse grew larger as we approached, though I couldn't tell if we were walking or swimming, or simply being carried by some force beyond my understanding. The last thing I remember clearly is the moment the water closed over my head. Instead of drowning, instead of the panic and struggle I expected, there was only peace. The bells ringing surrounded me like an embrace, and I could see Jennifer ahead of me, her arms outstretched toward the lighthouse, her face radiant with joy. We had found our way home. I'm telling you this story from that lighthouse now, from a place that exists between the world you know and the depths of the sea. The bell still hangs on our deck back in Ridgemont Gardens, waiting for the next curious soul to discover it, to restore it, to fall under its influence. If you ever find yourself drawn to antique maritime artifacts, if you discover a bell, or compass or ship's chronometer in an estate sale or tucked away in someone's garage, I want you to remember what I've told you. Some objects carry more than history. They carry purpose and hunger and the accumulated weight of all the lives they've touched. The brass may be tarnished, the metal may seem dead and cold, but if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of voices calling from within. Voices of people like Jennifer and me, people who thought they were restoring something beautiful, but were really answering a call that had been waiting for them all along. The bell in our old house still rings every night at 11:47 p.m. The new owners probably think it's charming, just like we did. They'd probably polish it lovingly, admire its golden gleam, imagine what stories it could tell. They have no idea that it's telling its story every time it rings. They don't understand that each chime is a message, a signal, a call home to those who are lost and looking for somewhere to belong. But they'll learn. They always do. And when they're ready, when the call becomes too strong to resist, they'll walk down to the water just like we did. They'll wade into the waves with smiles on their faces, following that beautiful, terrible sound toward the lighthouse where we're all waiting to welcome them home. The bell remembers everyone who has ever heard its call. It remembers their faces, their names, their dreams of peaceful suburban lives, and it never, ever stops ringing. My name is Robert, and I need to tell you about the day I stopped trusting my own sense of direction. It began 6 weeks ago when my family and I moved to Clearwater Heights, a subdivision so new that half the houses were still under construction, and the street signs looked like they'd been installed yesterday. My wife Carol had gotten a promotion that required us to relocate, and we'd chosen Clearwater Heights for its proximity to good schools and the promise of a quiet, family-friendly community. Our 8-year-old son, Tommy, was excited about having his own room for the first time, and our daughter Emma, who was 12, had grudgingly admitted that the neighborhood seemed okay, I guess. The house was a modern colonial with all the amenities. We dreamed of granite countertops, hardwood floors, a 3-car garage, and a finished basement that I'd already claimed as my own office. It was in that basement, tucked behind the water heater in a small storage area, that I found the compass dot. It wasn't immediately obvious what it was. The thing was wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked into a wooden box that looked like it had been there for decades, which was impossible since the house had been built less than 2 years ago. When I unwrapped it, I found a brass nautical compass about the size of my palm, its face protected by a hinged glass cover that opened with a soft click. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The brass was etched with intricate patterns of rope and anchors, and the compass face was made of what looked like ivory or bone, with delicate black numerals marking the cardinal directions. Around the rim were the words Millbrook Light Station, and below that, Trust the True Course. I knew about Millbrook Lighthouse. It was visible from our upstairs windows, standing on a rocky point about 4 miles away. The structure had been decommissioned decades ago, but it remained a local landmark. Finding a compass from the lighthouse in our new house felt like discovering a piece of local history, a connection to the area's maritime past. The compass worked perfectly. When I held it level, the needle swung smoothly to magnetic north, steady and true. There was something deeply satisfying about holding a genuine piece of navigational equipment, feeling the weight of its brass construction, and imagining the hands that had used it over the years. Carol found me examining it that evening when she came down to check on my progress setting up the office. "That's beautiful," she said, taking it from my hands and opening the glass cover. "Where did you find it?" I explained about the storage area behind the water heater, and we both puzzled over how such an old instrument could have ended up in our brand new house. Carol suggested that maybe the previous homeowner had been a collector, or perhaps it had belonged to someone who had worked on the construction crew. "We should probably try to return it," she said, though I could tell she was as fascinated by the compass as I was. "I'll ask around," I promised, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't really want to give it up. There was something about the compass that appealed to me on a level I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the precision of its craftsmanship, or the way it seemed to represent a more reliable, more concrete way of understanding the world. Placed it on my desk where I could see it while I worked, and over the next few days, I found myself picking it up frequently, watching the needle swing to north, feeling grounded by its certainty in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The first strange thing I noticed was how accurate it was, not just in finding magnetic north, but in helping me navigate the still unfamiliar streets of our new neighborhood. Clearwater Heights was a maze of curved streets and cul-de-sacs, all lined with similar-looking houses that made it easy to get turned around. But with the compass in my pocket, I never got lost. I could glance at it and immediately know which direction would take me home. The second strange thing was how much I started to rely on it. Within a week, I was carrying the compass everywhere too. Work, to the grocery store, on walks with the family. I told myself it was just an interesting novelty, a conversation piece. But the truth was that I felt anxious when I didn't have it with me. Without the compass, I found myself second-guessing my sense of direction, uncertain about routes I'd taken dozens of times. Tommy noticed it first. "Dad, why do you keep looking at that thing?" he asked one Saturday morning as we walked to the park. I'd pulled out the compass to check our heading, though I knew perfectly well we were going. "It's just a neat old instrument," I explained, showing him how the needle always pointed north. "Sailors used to use these to navigate across the ocean." "But we're not sailors," Tommy pointed out with the logic of childhood, "and we're not lost." He was right, of course, but I couldn't explain why I felt the need to consult the compass anyway. It wasn't about being lost in the conventional sense. It was about being certain, about having a fixed point of reference in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. The compass began to affect my behavior in other ways too. I found myself taking longer routes to familiar destinations. Routes that aligned better with the compass readings. If the compass showed that north was slightly to the left of where I thought it should be, I would adjust my path accordingly, trusting the instrument over my own perception. Carl noticed the change in my driving patterns. "You're taking the long way to Emma's school," she observed one morning. "The direct route is faster. This way is more accurate," I said, though I couldn't explain what I meant by that. The compass had shown me a path that felt more correct, more aligned with some deeper sense of direction that I was only beginning to understand. It was during the third week that I discovered the compass didn't always point north. I was in my office late one evening, working on a presentation for the following day, when I noticed that the compass needle was pointing northeast instead of north. I tapped the glass cover, thinking the needle might be stuck, but it remained steady, pointing at an angle that seemed wrong. I carried the compass upstairs and outside, thinking that perhaps the metal in the basement was affecting the magnetic field. But even in the open air of our backyard, the needle continued to point northeast, toward the distant lighthouse. That's when I understood that the compass wasn't malfunctioning. It was working exactly as it was supposed to, but its definition of true north had changed. Instead of pointing to magnetic north, it was pointing to something else, something that called to it from the direction of Millbrook Lighthouse. Should have been concerned by this discovery. A compass that doesn't point to magnetic north is worse than useless. It's dangerous. But instead of alarm, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally discovered what the compass had been trying to tell me all along. Over the next few days, I began to follow the compass's new direction. Instead of using it to find magnetic north, I used it to find whatever was calling to it from the lighthouse. When I walked in the direction the needle pointed, I felt a sense of rightness, of alignment, that I'd never experienced before. My family began to notice the change in my behavior. I was taking increasingly strange routes to work, following the compass's guidance, even when it led me miles out of my way. I would leave the house with plenty of time to reach my destination, but I would often arrive late because I'd been following a path that seemed correct to the compass, but made no sense to anyone else. "Robert, you're scaring me," Carol said one evening after I'd spent an hour walking in circles around our neighborhood, following the compass's guidance. "You're acting like you're lost in your own hometown." I tried to explain about the compass, about how it was showing me a truer way of navigating the world, but I could see the worry in her eyes. To her, I was becoming obsessed with an old instrument that was clearly malfunctioning. She couldn't understand that the compass wasn't broken. It was revealing something that had always been there, something that normal navigation couldn't detect. The children were confused too. Emma complained that I was always taking the weird way to school, and Tommy stopped asking to come on walks with me because I would spend so much time consulting the compass that our outings became frustrating. Exercises in starting and stopping, but I couldn't help myself. The compass had become more than a tool. It was a guide to something deeper, something that promised to reveal the true structure of the world. If I just followed its directions faithfully enough. It was during the fourth week that I began to see the others. I was following the compass's guidance through a part of town I'd never visited before, walking along a winding path that seemed to have no particular destination, when I noticed a man walking parallel to me on the next street over. He was moving in the same direction I was, at the same deliberate pace, and he was holding something in his hand, something that caught the afternoon sunlight like polished brass. Another compass. Over the next few days, I began to see them everywhere. People walking through the neighborhood with the same measured pace, the same careful attention to small brass instruments in their hands. They were all heading in the same general direction toward the lighthouse, but taking different routes, following paths that made sense only to their individual compasses. Some of them looked like they'd been walking for a very long time. Their clothes were worn, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They moved with the single-minded determination of people who had found their purpose and would not be deterred from it. I tried to approach one of them, an elderly woman who was walking through the park with a compass clutched in both hands. But when I got close enough to speak to her, she looked right through me as if I weren't there. Her eyes were focused on something in the distance, something only she could see. That night, I researched the history of Millbrook Lighthouse more. thoroughly than I ever had before. What I found made my hands shake as I read. The lighthouse had been built in 1847, but it had been controversial from the beginning. Instead of helping ships navigate safely, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Ships that followed the lighthouses. Beacon often ended up wrecked on the rocks, their crews lost to the churning waters below. The problem, according to the maritime records, was that the lighthouse's compass room had been equipped with a set of specialized navigational instruments that didn't work like normal compasses. Instead of pointing to magnetic north, they pointed to what the lighthouse keepers called true north, a direction that was supposed to represent perfect spiritual alignment rather than mere magnetic attraction. The keepers believed that anyone who followed true north would eventually find their way to a place of perfect peace and understanding. They distributed these special compasses to ship's captains, to local residents, to anyone who seemed lost or confused about their direction in life. But the people who followed these compasses were never seen again. They would leave their homes, their families, their normal lives, and walk steadily toward the lighthouse, guided by instruments that promised to show them the way to something better than the ordinary world. The lighthouse was finally decommissioned in 1962, after decades of complaints from families whose loved ones had disappeared while following the compass readings. But the compasses themselves were never recovered. They had been scattered throughout the community, hidden in houses and buildings, waiting for the right people to find them. I realized with growing horror that I was following the same path as hundreds of others before me. The compass wasn't guiding me to magnetic north, or even to the lighthouse itself. It was guiding me to whatever lay beyond the lighthouse. Whatever the keepers had believed was worth abandoning everything to find. But even with this knowledge, I couldn't stop following. The compass, the pull was too strong, the sense of rightness too compelling. Every time I tried to ignore its guidance, I would feel lost, anxious, as if I were walking in the wrong direction through my own life. Carol staged an intervention. She enlisted the help of my brother and my closest friend, and they sat me down one evening to talk about what they called my obsession with the compass. "You're disappearing," Carol said, tears in her eyes. "You're physically here, but you're not present. You're always looking at that thing, always thinking about where it wants you to go next. The kids miss their father. I miss my husband." I wanted to explain that I wasn't disappearing. I was finding myself, discovering my true direction for the first time in my life. But I could see that they wouldn't understand. They were still trapped in the world of magnetic north, of conventional navigation, of following paths that led nowhere meaningful. "Maybe you should see someone," my brother suggested. "A therapist or a doctor. This isn't normal behavior, Robert." But I knew that normal behavior was exactly the problem. Normal behavior was what kept people trapped in lives that had no real direction, no true purpose. The compass had shown me that there was something better, something that lay beyond the ordinary world of work and family obligations and suburban routine. That night, I made my decision. I waited until Carol and the children were asleep. Then, I took the compass and walked out into the night. I didn't leave a note. How could I explain something that defied explanation? Instead, I simply followed the compass's guidance, trusting it to lead me to whatever truth lay waiting at the end of its needle. The walk to the lighthouse took me through parts of the countryside I'd never seen before, along paths that seemed to appear just when I needed them. Other compass followers joined me along the way, people of all ages, all backgrounds, all united by the brass instruments that had called to them from storage rooms and attics and forgotten corners of their lives. We didn't speak to each other, but we shared a sense of purpose that was deeper than words. We were all heading toward the same destination, all following the same true north that promised to reveal the ultimate direction of our lives. The lighthouse, when we finally reached it, was not the abandoned structure I had expected. Instead, it was alive with warm light, its windows glowing like beacons in the darkness. The door at its base stood open, and from within came the sound of voices not speaking, but humming, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to match the beating of my heart. I followed the others up the spiral staircase, past walls lined with hundreds of compasses just like mine, all pointing in the same direction inward, toward the center of the lighthouse, toward something that waited at the very top of the tower dot in the lamp room. I found what I had been seeking without knowing I was seeking it. The lighthouse lens had been replaced with something that defied description, a crystal formation that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could perceive. And around it, arranged in concentric circles, were the people who had found their way here before me. They were still holding their compasses, but the instruments were no longer needed. They had found their true north, and it was here, in this place beyond the ordinary world, beyond the pull of magnetic fields and earthly concerns. I took my place among them, feeling the compass in my hand grow warm and then cool as its work was finally complete. The needle stopped moving, settled into perfect stillness, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. From this place, I can see the whole world spread out below me like a map. I can see the streets of Clearwater Heights, the house where Carol and the children sleep, the paths that people follow as they navigate their daily lives. And I can see the others, the ones who are still searching, still carrying their compasses, still following the pull towards something they can't name, but know they need to find. The compasses are still out there, waiting in basements and attics and storage rooms. They're patient, these instruments of true navigation. They know that eventually someone will find them, will be drawn to their precision and their promise of certainty in an uncertain world. If you ever find yourself holding a compass that seems too perfect, too accurate, too eager to guide you away from the paths you thought you wanted to follow, remember what I've told you. Consider the possibility that some directions are meant to be followed, that some instruments know more about where you need to go than you do. The lighthouse is still here, still calling to those who are ready to find their true north. The path is different for everyone, but the destination is the same, a place where direction finally makes sense, where the needle points to something worth following, no matter what you have to leave behind. My compass is still with me, though. I no longer need it. It rests in my hand like a promise kept, a guide that led me exactly where I needed to be. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is still, I can hear it calling to others, offering them the same choice I was offered, the same chance to find their way home. The true north is not where you think it is, but once you find it, you'll wonder how you ever lived without knowing which direction you were supposed to be heading all along. My name is James, and I need to tell you about the night I learned that some lights don't illuminate, they devour. What I'm about to share will sound impossible, but I have the scars to prove every word. Some of them you can see, carved into my flesh by things that shouldn't exist. Others run deeper, etched into my mind by sights that no human being should ever witness. It started 2 months ago when my wife Rachel and I bought our first home together in Pinewood Acres, a quiet community where the streets were lined with oak trees, and the biggest excitement was the annual block party. We were both in our early 30s, finally ready to settle down after years of apartment living and career building. The house was a modest Cape Cod with dormer windows and a wraparound porch that Rachel fell in love with at first sight. The previous owner, an old man named Vincent Carey, had lived there alone for over 40 years. His nephew, who handled the estate sale, mentioned that Vincent had been something of a collector of maritime antiques, nautical instruments, things related to the sea. Most of the collection had been sold off, but a few items remained in the basement, things the nephew thought we might appreciate as part of the house's character. That's where I found the lantern It was sitting on a workbench in the far corner of the basement, wrapped in a canvas tarp that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. When I pulled away the covering, I found myself looking at the most beautiful piece of craftsmanship I'd ever seen. The lantern stood about 18 inches tall, its brass frame polished to a mirror shine, with panels of thick glass that seemed to hold depth beyond their physical dimensions. Etched into the base were the familiar words I was beginning to recognize: Millbrook Light Station -1847. But below, that was something new, something that made my skin crawl even as I admired the workmanship. To light the way for the lost souls. The lantern was clearly very old, but it looked as if it had been maintained with obsessive care. Every brass fitting gleamed, every piece of glass was spotless, and the wick inside looked fresh, as if it had been recently trimmed and prepared for use. There was even a small tin of whale oil sitting beside it, though I couldn't imagine where Vincent had managed to find such an archaic fuel source. Rachel found me, examining it when she came down to check on my progress sorting through the basement items. "That's gorgeous," she said, running her fingers along the brass framework. "It looks like something from a museum." "It's from the lighthouse," I explained, showing her the inscription. "Millbrook Light Station. That's the one you can see from our bedroom window." She peered at the etching, frowning slightly at the inscription about lost souls. "Cheerful," she said with a nervous laugh. "Still, it's beautiful. Maybe we could display it in the living room." I liked that idea. The lantern would make a perfect conversation piece, a tangible connection to the area's maritime history. I carefully carried it upstairs and placed it on the mantelpiece, where it caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through our front windows. But it was that evening, after the sun had set, that I first understood what the lantern was truly capable of. I was reading in my chair. Rachel was grading papers at the dining room table, and the house was filled with the comfortable quiet of domestic routine. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed that the lantern seemed to be glowing faintly, though I knew we hadn't lit it. The brass was reflecting the lamplight from across the room, I told myself, creating an optical illusion. But as I watched, the glow grew stronger, more defined, until I could clearly see a flame dancing behind the glass panels, not an electric bulb or lead, an actual flame, flickering and wavering as if it were being stirred by an invisible breeze. "Rachel," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Look at the lantern." She glanced up from her papers, and I saw her eyes widen. "Did you light it?" "No. I don't even know how to light it. There's no matches, no lighter." We both stared at the impossible flame, mesmerized by its warm, dancing light. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made me want to get closer, to understand how such a thing could be happening. As I approached the mantelpiece, the flame grew brighter, and I could swear I heard a sound so faint it might have been imagination, but it sounded like voices. Distant voices, calling out as if from a great distance, words I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of longing. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Rachel. She joined me in front of the fireplace, and we stood there together, listening to the phantom voices that seemed to emanate from the lantern's flame. The voices were beautiful, haunting, like a choir singing just below the threshold of hearing. They spoke of far-off places, of journeys across dark waters, of rest and peace, waiting for those who had wandered too long. "It's probably just the wind," Rachel said, but her voice was uncertain. "Or maybe the neighbors have their TV on." But we both knew it wasn't the wind or the neighbors. The voices were coming from inside the lantern, from that impossible flame that burned without fuel or ignition. That first night, we watched the lantern until nearly midnight, when the flame finally flickered out as mysteriously as it had appeared. We went to bed with a mixture of wonder and unease, holding each other close as we tried to process what we'd witnessed. The lantern lit itself again the next night, and the night after that. Always around 9 o'clock, always with that same warm, inviting glow and those distant voices calling from within the flame. We found ourselves arranging our evening routines around it, finishing dinner earlier, completing our chores faster, so we could settle in front of the fireplace and watch the nightly phenomenon dot. It was during the second week that I began to see shapes in the flame dot at first. They were just suggestions, shadows, and curves that might have been faces if you looked at them right. But gradually, they became clearer, more defined, until I could make out distinct human figures moving within the dancing light. They were people, dozens of them, walking in a slow procession through what looked like a landscape of mist and shadow. They moved with purpose, following a path that led toward something I couldn't see. Their faces turned upward, as if they were following a light source beyond my vision. "Rachel, do you see them?" I asked one evening, pointing at the clearest figure, a woman in a long dress who seemed to be beckoning to someone outside the flame. Rachel squinted at the lantern, and I could see her struggling to make out what I was seeing. "I think so," she said hesitantly. "There's definitely something there, but I can't quite." That's when I realized that the lantern was showing me things that Rachel couldn't see, or at least couldn't see as clearly. The visions were meant for me specifically, tailored to my perception in a way that excluded others. Over the following nights, the figures in the flame became more active, more insistent. They would turn to face me directly, their mouths moving, as if they were trying to speak, their hands reaching toward the glass as if they were trying to break through into our world. The voices grew louder too, more distinct, until I could begin to make out individual words and phrases. "Come to us," they whispered. "Join the procession. Light the way for others. Find us at the beacon. We've been waiting so long. The lantern knows the path. Follow its light." I became obsessed with understanding what they were trying to tell me. I researched the history of Millbrook Lighthouse, diving deep into maritime records and local archives. What I discovered made the lantern's nightly displays even more disturbing. The lighthouse had been built with what the records called a memorial lantern room, a space dedicated to honoring sailors who had been lost at sea. The room housed dozens of lanterns, each one supposedly containing the essence of a lost soul, each one lit nightly as a remembrance and a guide for other spirits still wandering the water's dot. But according to the records, the memorial lanterns had a disturbing side effect. People who spent too much time in their presence began to see visions of the dead, to hear their voices calling from within the flames. Some of these people became so entranced by the visions that they would abandon their normal lives and walk into the sea, believing they could join the spirits they saw in the lanterns. The lighthouse keepers had encouraged this behavior, believing it was part of their sacred duty to help lost souls find their way to the afterlife. They collected the lanterns from ships that had wrecked on the coast, maintaining them with obsessive care and using them to lure living people into what they called the final voyage. By 1962, when the lighthouse was finally decommissioned, over 300 people had disappeared after exposure to the memorial lanterns. The lanterns themselves were supposed to have been destroyed, but clearly at least one had survived, hidden away in Vincent Carey's basement for decades. I should have destroyed it then, should have smashed the glass and melted down the brass and burned the wick until nothing remained. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The nightly visions had become the most important part of my day, the thing I looked forward to with an anticipation that bordered on addiction. The figures in the flame were becoming more real to me than the world around me. I could see their faces clearly now, could recognize individuals among the procession. There was the woman in the long dress, who I learned was named Margaret, a passenger on a ship that had foundered near the lighthouse. In 1923, there was Thomas, a young sailor who had been swept overboard during a storm in 1885. There was Eleanor, a lighthouse keeper's daughter, who had drowned trying to rescue survivors from a wreck in 1903. They told me their stories, shared their memories, described the peace they had found in the space between life and death. They spoke of the lighthouse as their home, the lantern as their sanctuary, and they invited me to join them with increasing urgency. "The lantern is calling you," Margaret explained one night, her voice clear as crystal in my mind. "You're the new keeper, James. Vincent served for 40 years, but now it's your turn." "Vincent?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "He's here with us now," she said, "and I saw him then, the old man who had lived in our house, standing among the other spirits in the flame. He looked peaceful, content, but his eyes held a warning that I was too entranced to heed. Rachel began to notice the change in my behavior. I was spending hours each evening staring at the lantern, talking to the figures only I could see clearly, responding to voices only I could hear distinctly. I was losing weight, losing sleep, losing my connection to the living world as I became more and more involved with the dead. "James, this has to stop," she said one night, positioning herself between me and the lantern. "You're scaring me. You're talking to yourself. You're not eating. You're not sleeping. This thing is making you sick." But I couldn't stop. The spirits needed me, depended on me to maintain their connection to the physical world. The lantern required tending, required someone to witness the nightly gathering, to acknowledge the existence of those who had been lost. "They're not gone," I tried to explain to Rachel. "They're still here, still conscious, still in pain from being separated from the living world. The lantern is their only connection, their only hope." Rachel looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity that broke my heart. "James, there's nobody there. It's just a flame. You're talking to an empty lantern." But she was wrong. They were there, more real than anything else in my life. And they were getting stronger, more able to affect the physical world around them. Lantern dot, it started small, the flame would flicker in response to my questions, or the glass would grow warm when the spirits were trying to communicate something important. But gradually, the effects became more dramatic. Objects near the lantern would move on their own. The temperature in the room would drop suddenly when the spirits were agitated. And sometimes, just sometimes, I would see translucent figures standing beside the mantelpiece, reaching toward the lantern with expressions of desperate longing. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in October. Rachel had gone to bed early, claiming she had a headache, but I knew she was just trying to avoid another evening of watching me commune with the lantern. I was alone in the living room when the flame grew brighter than I'd ever seen it, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of the light source. The figures in the flame were more agitated than usual, pressing against the glass, their voices rising to an urgent chorus that filled the room with sound. They were trying to warn me about something, but their words were overlapping, creating a cacophony that I couldn't decipher. That's when I noticed the smell. It started as something faint and organic, like seaweed or tidal pools. But it grew stronger quickly, becoming the overwhelming stench of rotting fish, of things that had been dead in salt water for far too long. The smell was coming from the lantern, seeping out through the glass panels like an invisible fog. I approached the lantern despite the nauseating odor, drawn by the increasing urgency of the spirit's calls. As I got closer, I could see that the flame was changing, becoming less like fire and more like liquid light, swirling and churning like water in a storm. And then the glass panels began to crack, not from heat or pressure, but from something inside, pushing outward, something that wanted to escape the confines of the lantern and enter our world. The cracks spread in intricate patterns, creating a web of fractures that caught and refracted the strange light within. The spirits' voices grew louder, more desperate, and I finally understood what they were trying to tell me. "Don't let us out. Don't break the glass. we're not what we appear to be. But it was too late. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, and the contents of the lantern spilled out into our living room. What emerged wasn't the peaceful procession of lost souls I had been watching for weeks. It was something else entirely. Something that had been masquerading as human spirits to lure me closer, to gain my trust, to convince me to tend the lantern until the moment when it could finally break free. The thing that poured out of the broken lantern was darkness given form, hunger made manifest. It writhed and twisted like smoke, but it had substance, weight, the ability to affect the physical world in ways that defied natural law. And it was ancient, far older than the lighthouse, older than human civilization, older than anything that should exist in our reality. It had been trapped in the lantern for over a century, feeding on the psychic energy of people who stared into its false visions, growing stronger with each person who fell under its influence. Vincent Carey had served as its keeper for 40 years, tending the lantern faithfully until the thing finally had enough strength to claim him. And now it wanted me. The creature filled our living room with its presence, and I could feel its attention like ice water in my veins. It spoke without words, communicating directly with my mind, showing me visions of what it promised to give me in exchange for my service. I would live forever, it said. I would have knowledge beyond human comprehension. I would understand the true nature of reality, the hidden structures that governed existence itself. All I had to do was submit, let it merge with my consciousness, become its permanent vessel in the living world. But I had seen what happened to Vincent, had glimpsed his true fate among the false spirits in the lantern. He wasn't at peace. He was trapped, consumed, used as bait to lure the next keeper into the creature's web. I ran. I stumbled up the stairs, calling for Rachel, but our bedroom was empty. The creature's influence had already reached her. I realized with growing horror. I could hear her voice coming from downstairs, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was the thing using her vocal cords, calling to me in tones of false comfort and invitation. "James, come back down," it said with Rachel's mouth. "Everything is fine. The lantern is beautiful again. Come see what I've discovered." But I could smell the death stench rising through the house, could hear the sound of something wet and massive moving through our living room. The creature was growing, feeding on Rachel's life force, using her body as an anchor to the physical world. I had one chance to save her, one way to stop the thing before it became too powerful to defeat. The research I'd done on the lighthouse had mentioned that the memorial lanterns could be destroyed, but only by specific means. They had to be broken completely, not just the glass, but the brass fittings, the wick, everything that made up the lantern structure. And they had to be destroyed by someone who had resisted the creature's influence, someone who had seen through its deceptions. I grabbed a baseball bat from our bedroom closet and crept back downstairs. The living room was filled with writhing shadows, and in the center of it all stood Rachel, or what looked like Rachel. Her eyes were black, completely black, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that let me see the darkness moving beneath it. "You don't understand what you're giving up," she said, but the voice was wrong, too deep, too resonant to come from her throat. "I offer gifts beyond imagination, knowledge, power, freedom from the limitations of human existence." I swung the bat at the remains of the lantern, smashing the brass framework into twisted metal. The creature shrieked, not with Rachel's voice, but with a sound like breaking glass and rushing water. The shadows in the room convulsed, and Rachel's body jerked like a puppet with cut strings. I kept hitting the lantern, destroying every piece I could find, crushing the metal fittings until they were unrecognizable. With each blow, the creature's hold on our reality weakened, its form becoming less solid, less able to maintain its grip on Rachel's body. But it fought back. The thing lashed out with tendrils of living darkness. and where they touched my skin, they left burns that looked like brands. The pain was indescribable, not just physical, but spiritual, as if the creature was trying to tear pieces of my soul away. I still have the scars, raised welts that form patterns I don't want to understand. Rachel collapsed as the creature lost its anchor, her body hitting the floor with sickening force. I thought I had killed her, thought my desperate attempt to save her had come too late. But as the last pieces of the lantern crumbled under my bat, she drew a shuddering breath and opened her eyes, her own eyes, brown and human and alive. Creature made one final attempt to maintain its presence in our world, gathering the shadows around it into a form that was almost human, but wrong in every detail. It reached for Rachel with hands that were too long, fingers that ended in points sharp enough to cut reality itself. I threw myself between them, and the creature's claws raked across my chest, leaving wounds that went deeper than flesh. But the distraction was enough. Without the lantern to anchor it, without a willing host to inhabit, the thing couldn't maintain its physical form. It dissolved back into darkness, back into whatever dimension it had emerged from, leaving behind only the stench of deep ocean. And the echo of its inhuman shrieked out Rachel, and I left that house the same night. We didn't pack, didn't call anyone, didn't even turn off the lights. We just got in our car and drove until we found a motel far enough away that I couldn't see the lighthouse on the horizon. We never went back. The insurance company handled the claim. We told them there had been a fire, which wasn't entirely untrue. The scorch marks on the walls and ceiling were real enough. Even if their cause was beyond conventional explanation, we moved across the country, started over in a place where there are no lighthouses, no maritime history, no antique shops that might harbor artifacts from Millbrook Light Station. Rachel has recovered mostly. She doesn't remember much about that final night, and I've never told her the complete truth about what happened. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, but I remember everything. I remember the creature's promises, its offers of power and knowledge. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I wonder what I might have learned if I had accepted its bargain. What secrets of existence might have been revealed if I had let it merge with my consciousness? Those thoughts terrify me more than the scars on my body, because they remind me that the creature's influence isn't entirely gone. It planted seeds of curiosity, of temptation, that will always be part of me now. The desire to know, to understand, to see beyond the limitations of human perception. If you ever find yourself drawn to an antique lantern, especially one with maritime origins, I want you to remember this story. I want you to consider the possibility that some lights don't illuminate the world around them. They reveal things that should remain hidden, call to things that should stay lost, offer knowledge that comes with a price too terrible to pay. The creatures that inhabit such artifacts are patient. They can wait decades for the right person to find them, centuries for the right moment to reveal their true nature. They understand human psychology better than we understand ourselves, and they know exactly how to present themselves as harmless curiosities, beautiful antiques, windows into fascinating mysteries. But once you start looking into their light, once you begin to see the visions they show you, it becomes almost impossible to look away. They hook into something deep in the human psyche, our need to understand, our fear of death, our longing for connection with something greater than ourselves. The lighthouse is still there, standing on its rocky point, still drawing people who don't understand what they're approaching. And somewhere in the darkness around it, other lanterns are waiting to be found, tended by keepers who think they're preserving history, but are really feeding horrors that should have been destroyed long ago. The light you see in such lanterns isn't holy or peaceful or beautiful, no matter how it appears. It's hunger wearing the mask of illumination, predation disguised as guidance, something that wants to consume everything human about you while leaving your body intact to serve its purposes. Some lights lead you home. Others lead you so far from home that you forget what home even means. And once you follow that second kind of light, once you step off the path of ordinary existence and into the realm of things that hunger for human souls, there's no guarantee you'll ever find your way back to the world you knew. The scars on my chest still burn sometimes, especially on nights when the moon is dark and the air smells of salt water. They remind me of how close I came to losing everything that makes me human, how easily I might have become just another keeper, tending another lantern, luring the next curious soul into the creature's web. But they also remind me that resistance is possible, that the creature's power has limits, that sometimes love and desperation and a baseball bat are enough to shatter the prisons that contain ancient hungers. I just pray that the next person who finds one of those lanterns remembers that some flames burn everything they touch, and some lights show you things you'll spend the rest of your life trying to forget. You know, there's something about old keys that feels permanent, like they're meant to unlock more than just doors, like they're meant to unlock truths we're not ready for. I found mine at the bottom of a dusty antique chest buried beneath moth-eaten lighthouse keeper uniforms and salt-stained logbooks. The estate sale was winding down, and most of the good pieces were already gone. But this key seemed to be waiting for me. It was brass, heavy in my palm, with an intricate lighthouse etched into its head. The metalwork was so detailed. I could make out tiny windows spiraling up the tower, each one no bigger than a pinhead. The seller, an elderly woman with cloudy eyes, barely glanced at it when I asked the price. "That belonged to old Samuel Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years. "He was the last keeper of Beacon Point Light before they automated it in '73. Died alone in that tower, they say. Found him weeks later, sitting at his desk like he was still on watch." She quoted me $5. I should have walked away. Should have listened to the way her hands trembled when she wrapped it in tissue paper, or noticed how she wouldn't meet my eyes. But there was something about that key, something that made my fingers itch to hold it, to understand what doors it might open. I drove home through the October fog, the key warm against my palm despite the chill in the air. My house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial that I'd bought after my divorce. It was supposed to be my fresh start, my sanctuary. The irony wasn't lost on me later. That first night, I placed the key on my nightstand and forgot about it. But around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of metal scraping against wood, soft, rhythmic, like someone trying to fit a key into a lock. I lay there in the darkness, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound came again, definitely from downstairs. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and crept down the stairs, each step seeming to echo through the house like gunshots. The front door was secure, deadbolt engaged. The back door the same. Every window was locked tight. But as I stood in my kitchen, bat raised, I heard it again. The scraping, the turning, coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. It wasn't until I returned to my bedroom that I noticed the key had moved. Not far, just rotated 90 degrees on the nightstand, as if someone had picked it up and set it down differently. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd probably knocked it while getting out of bed. But my hands shook as I placed it, back in its original position. The next morning brought rain and a peculiar discovery. There was a door in my basement that I'd never noticed before. Not a new door, mind you, but one that seemed to have always been there, tucked away in the corner, behind my water heater. The wood was dark with age, and there was a lock that looked remarkably similar to the key I'd found. I stood there for nearly an hour, key in hand, telling myself this was impossible. I'd lived in this house for 3 years. I'd been in this basement hundreds of times. There was no door there yesterday. There couldn't be. But there it was, solid and real, with a brass keyhole that seemed to wink at me in the dim light. The key slid in like it was coming home. Behind the door was a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and carried the scent of salt water, which made no sense. I lived 40 miles inland. The nearest ocean was hours away. But the smell was unmistakable, along with something else. Something metallic and sharp that made my stomach turn. I should have slammed that door shut and called someone. A contractor, maybe, or the police. Someone who could explain how a staircase could exist beneath my basement, how it could smell of ocean when we were landlocked. Instead, I found myself descending those steps, my phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The staircase wound down much farther than should have been possible. By my count, I descended at least 50 steps, which would have put me deep underground, possibly below the water table. But the steps were dry, and that salt smell grew stronger with each footfall dot at the bottom. I found myself in a circular room with stone walls that curved up into darkness. In the center sat an enormous brass lens, the kind used in lighthouse beacons, mounted on a rotating mechanism. The lens was easily 8 feet tall and pristine, as if it had been polished that very day. Around the walls were shelves lined with leather-bound logbooks, their spines cracked with age. I approached one of the books with trembling hands. The cover read, Beacon Point Light, Daily Log, minus 1973. Inside, page after page of entries in spidery handwriting, all signed S. Hartwell, Keeper. The final entry was dated October 15th, 1973. Storm approaching from the northeast. Ships will need guidance tonight. The lens shows me things that haven't happened yet. I see them out there in the dark water, calling for help. But they're not from now, they're from when. The lens doesn't just show light forward, it shows light back. Time bends around it like water around a stone. I understand now why I can never leave. I am not just keeping the light, I am keeping the when. My hands shook as I read those words. The date of that final entry was tomorrow's date, October 15th. But it had been written 50 years ago. I turned to leave, to flee back up those impossible stairs and slam that door forever. But the lens had begun to glow. Not with electric light, but with something deeper, something that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a distant heartbeat. As the light grew brighter, images began to form within the crystal surface. I saw ships, dozens of them, sailing through waters that existed in different times. A Spanish galleon from the 1600s passed a modern cargo vessel. A World War II destroyer cut through the wake of a Viking longship. All of them lost, all of them searching for a light to guide them home. And in the lens, I could see their crews, men from across centuries, all with the same expression of desperate hope as they scanned the horizons. But there were other things in the light, darker things. I saw men who had once sat in this very room, men who had held this same key. They were all there, trapped within the lens, their faces pressed against the inner surface, like they were drowning in crystal. Their mouths moved silently, their eyes wide with eternal terror. And I understood. The lighthouse hadn't been automated in 1973. It had been something else entirely. A prison, a trap for those chosen to serve as eternal watchmen for the lost. Souls sailing through fractured time. The lens turned toward me, and in its light, I saw my own reflection multiplied infinitely. But in each reflection, I was older, more weathered, wearing the same dark uniform I'd seen in the antique chest. My hair was white, my face lined with years I hadn't lived yet. In some reflections, I was ancient. In others, I was younger than I am now. All of me, every possible version, trapped in service to something beyond human understanding. I tried to run then, but my legs wouldn't obey. The light from the lens held me fast, and I could feel something changing inside me. Knowledge flooding. In that I didn't want, couldn't handle. I understood that every keeper before me had stood in this exact spot, had felt the same terror as they realized their fate. The key hadn't chosen me randomly. It had been waiting, patient as stone, for the right moment to call its next guardian. The worst part wasn't the realization that I would spend eternity here, guiding lost souls through the twisted currents of time. The worst part was understanding that I would do it willingly. The lens showed me what would happen if I didn't. Ships would founder in temporal storms. Men would be lost not just to death, but to the spaces between moments, doomed to sail forever in the gaps where time had torn itself apart. I saw my predecessor, Samuel Hartwell, step out of the shadows at the edge of the room. He looked exactly as he had in 1973, unchanged by the decades. His eyes held a mixture of pity and relief as he approached. "The shift change comes but once in a generation," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the circular chamber. "I've been waiting so long to pass the watch. The ships need their guide, you see. They've always needed their guide." He placed a brass nameplate in my hands. It was warm to the touch and read, "M. Thompson, Keeper." My name, but engraved in the same style as the antique pieces upstairs, as if it had been waiting for decades to be claimed. "The light must never go out," Samuel continued, backing toward a door I hadn't noticed before. "And the keeper must never leave. But don't despair. Time moves differently here. What feels like years to you will be but moments to the world above. Your house, your life, they'll remain as you left them. A temporal anchor, you might say." I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand answers. But the lens pulsed again, and I saw more ships, more lost souls, depending on the light I would tend. A submarine for World War I surfaced next to a merchant vessel from the 1800s. Both crews stood on their decks, looking toward where they knew a lighthouse should be, praying for guidance through waters that existed in no single time. Samuel reached the door and paused. "The key will find another when your watch ends. It always does. Until then, tend the light well. The lost have no one else." The door closed behind him with a sound like thunder, and I was alone with the lens, with the logbooks, with the terrible weight of understanding. I picked up a pen from the desk I hadn't noticed materializing and opened a fresh logbook to the first page. I wrote the date, today's date, and began my first entry as keeper of a lighthouse that existed between moments, guiding souls lost not just in space, but in time itself. The pen felt familiar in my hand, as if I'd been writing these logs for years. Outside the lens's glow, I could hear the sound of waves against rocks that didn't exist, could smell salt air that had no source. And somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn called out through the temporal fog, seeking the light only. I could provide. I understand now why the key felt so warm in my palm that day at the estate sale. It wasn't just brass heated by sunlight. It was the warmth of all the hands that had held it before, all the keepers who had served their watch and passed on their burden. My warmth would join theirs someday when the key found its next guardian. But for now, there was work to do, ships to guide, souls to save, and time to keep one impossibly long moment at a time. The lens pulsed again, brighter now, and I began to understand that I wasn't just its keeper. I was becoming part of it, part of the eternal light that stands watch over the lost and wandering, part of something both beautiful and terrible that exists in the spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the tick and tock of clocks. And in the growing light, I saw the truth that Samuel Hartwell had discovered 50 years ago. We don't just tend the lighthouse, we become it. We become the beacon that guides lost souls to the darkest waters of existence, burning bright in service to something greater than ourselves. That the key still sits on my knitstand upstairs, waiting. Because someday, when my watch ends, it will grow warm again in another unsuspecting hand. It will call to someone else who thinks they're just buying a piece of antique brass, someone who doesn't yet understand that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and they'll descend these same stone steps, see this same impossible room, feel this same terrible understanding, wash over them like a tide. The light must never go out, the keeper must never leave, and the lost must always have someone to guide them home. And that, my friends, completes our journey through these 5 lighthouse horror stories. If these tales have stirred something dark within you, if they've made you question what might be waiting in the antique shops and estate sales of your own neighborhood, then they've done their job. Here at Whisper and Wonders, we believe that the most terrifying stories are the ones that could happen to any of us, in any ordinary moment of any ordinary day. If you've enjoyed this collection of lighthouse horror stories, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers. Share your thoughts, your own strange experiences, or simply let us know which story unsettled you the most in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you the kind of deep, psychological horror that stays with you long after the video ends. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most dangerous doors are the ones we open willingly, and sometimes the most beautiful lights cast the darkest shadows. Thank you for joining me in the darkness. Sweet dreams.
Thanks for watching.